I was lucky. Let me just say a kind of encouraging word at the beginning that maybe you all know that a whole lot of LNG facility proposals around the country have been defeated by citizen activists, especially on the East Coast and the West Coast. But nonetheless, it is encouraging to know that when people raise very cogently the kinds of risk that they are opposed to, that sometimes they can actually defeat really major LNG facility proposals. Yours is not a major facility. Yours is a relatively small facility, but nonetheless, it poses some disaster hazards, which I'll try to outline as we go along. Let me mention that I learned this afternoon by talking to one of the experts on LNG modeling that I had asked him, well, since WE company has said they're going to use Degatis, which is a gas modeling program to basically illustrate what could happen at the facility, is that an appropriate use of Degatis? And Degatis is technically spelled D-E-G-A-D-I-S. In the WE application, it's misspelled. It's Degatis, but with a U-S at the end, so that's a little bit careless on their part. In any case, I just want to let you know that the federal regulations do not require that the company making a proposal has to, an LNG proposal, has to model both explosion and dispersion modeling. In other words, Degatis will only be used if it were in a federal regulatory context, only for dispersion modeling, not for explosion modeling. And the second point I just want to make on Degatis before I get off that is that I was tutored this afternoon about how you can cheat on Degatis, how a company can use Degatis, but in a way to minimize the risks, to apparently minimize the risk, and that is by choosing a release scenario that is from a very small hole or from a very small amount that is released. In other words, it's possible to use Degatis in a regular way, but you can, if you start off with assumptions that the release is very small, then you can probably say, and this release is not going to get outside the boundaries of the facility and impact into the community, which is the goal of getting it approved. So the main upshot of that is that Wisconsin as a state has got authority over these kinds of intrastate facilities. I presume that your proposed facility is what would be called an intrastate facility, meaning they only plan to sell LNG or to provide LNG to users within the state. I don't have any idea at all that they're going to be an export facility or be tied into any jurisdiction, not the federal agencies. The federal agencies will have conceded that to state agencies. The state agency will then have to hire a consultant who will do the risk study using Degatis and so forth. And then what that means is that our side would have to critique that. I mean, anybody who wants to challenge what the state comes up with. The state is very likely to be able to find ways of showing that this facility is going to meet federal standards. That's just the word that I got. And so we just have to be ready for that side of things. Let me say that there's what can happen from an LNG facility. I mean, your facility is being misrepresented in some ways. Your facility is already being misrepresented as a quote storage facility, when in fact it is a liquefaction and storage facility and a transfer facility. I mean, there's a lot going on that facility besides just kind of being this big storage tank. My understanding is that, I mean, when I had a look at your at the application from WE, I think the main thing to say about that is that they're trying to sell you a pig in a poke, in the sense that they don't, it is a very minimal application, as you no doubt can see. It doesn't describe the plant in any detail. So it's very difficult to make any kind of estimate about the risks of this facility, because we have very, very little information about the facility in terms of volumes or pressures or anything. And so that's just something to keep in mind, is that I think your first contact with your local officials will be basically one of saying, look, it's premature to try to get an approval from any regulatory body or from any legislative body on such little information. The risks of this facility really cannot be estimated at all with the kinds of information that you currently have. The WE application is so minimal that it basically, when you do a search for risk-related terms in the application, you don't find them. I mean, for example, they don't mention the term LNG release. Imagine. They don't mention the truck loading racks, for example. They don't mention, now I assume they're gonna have truck loading as well as sending some material out by pipeline. I'm not positive about that. They don't mention the possible need for vapor barrier walls around the facility or for blast walls. It basically just looks like it's a very passive facility that only does some kind of storage, and that is misleading. In fact, though, it's important to know there have been some very big disasters with storage of hazardous chemicals of different kinds. I'll mention a couple of non-LNG first. In West Texas, for example, in the town of West Texas, there was an ammonium nitrate storage facility in a wooden building, which had a fire. And when the local emergency responders were called to what they thought was just a structural fire, and they started approaching, it turned out to be an ammonium nitrate storage facility, which blew up in their faces and killed 12 of them. The second thing to mention that is on the same chemical is just because what happened very recently in Beirut, Lebanon. That was an ammonium nitrate storage facility located inside an urban port. And now ports in other countries are now scrambling to try to get rid of whatever ammonium nitrate they might have stored in their ports. It was stored very quietly. Big disasters like this, they'll always stand up and say, how come nobody told me this could happen? And actually that leads into a later question about your rights and your ways forward. And that is that when we had the enormous Bhopal tragedy with an American company back in 1984 with a toxic gas cloud release, the reaction in the United States was, could it happen here? And in response, Congress enacted community right to know laws. Maybe you've already gone over all that ground and I don't need to do that. But I mean, basically, of any proposed facility or any existing facility is. In terms of United States experience, there was a storage tank in Cleveland, Ohio, actually the first major LNG facility in the United States. In 1944, that whole tank collapsed and released the LNG. And the LNG, once it gets outside the refrigeration facility of the tank, with terrific insulation, the refrigeration unit, and once it gets outside the insulated tank, it boils furiously and forms a huge vapor cloud, which is 600 times bigger than the liquid. And so basically, what you had in Cleveland was this vapor cloud moving throughout a 1 square mile area in Cleveland. It got into the sewer system and spread all over the place, and you had explosions all over the place, because when you confine LNG, even without ignition, confining LNG can lead to spontaneous explosions, what's called a confined vapor cloud explosion. And 128 people died in Cleveland, Ohio, our very first major LNG disaster. Let me mention that there are two kinds of explosions that we need to be thinking about in relation to LNG. One is you can have an unconfined vapor cloud explosion, meaning, and the reason that we sort of know a lot about this but previously, up until a couple of years ago, all the scientists agreed you can't have an unconfined vapor cloud explosion with various kinds of chemicals like LNG and others. Well, in the meantime, though, we've had some really good research done by a British laboratory called Health and Safety Laboratory, which was actually funded by the US agency, PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which has a lot of regulatory authority, along with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Those two US agencies share jurisdiction on LNG matters, as well as sometimes in terms of port activities, the Coast Guard has a role as well. But the scientists had thought that an unconfined vapor cloud explosion was just impossible until we had a bunch of them. And in fact, when I say a bunch, I mean 20 major ones covered in the UK report, the HSC report from the UK, and including 4 major ones that they highlighted with photos and everything. One of which was in Buncefield, England, which was a gasoline explosion, and then more others were in India and in a couple of other countries. But again, not LNG yet. LNG has not been a major part of the United States' energy picture until very recently. It has not been a major part, just a kind of a niche part of the overall U.S. energy supply system. So the second kind of explosion that one can have is a confined vapor cloud explosion. And what that means, it is now very well established that if your LNG facility, for example, has a vapor cloud that either is unignited at the site and moves out into the community, if it then gets confined, that's the technical word the scientists use, meaning if it gets up against a wall, or down into a ditch, or in between 2 houses, or under some trucks, it can just spontaneously blow up even without ignition. Now, if it is ignited at the site, if the cloud is ignited, and it readily ignites, but if the cloud ignites at the site of the release, you get a huge fire, really tall, huge fire. If the cloud is ignited after it moves off the site into the community, you can get another huge fire, which then also can flash back to the point of release. Or you can get these confined vapor cloud explosions. Either of those kinds of outcomes or of course, if the cloud just sits around and nothing happens, it doesn't get confined and there's no ignition, the cloud can eventually dissipate. Industry would love folks to think that the natural gas industry would love folks to think that they say all the time, LNG does not explode. And that's right, technically. LNG does not explode. But when LNG turns into a vapor, it's a natural gas vapor that does explode and does burn really, really readily with potentially really terrible consequences. So you can have also a phenomenon which is called cascading impacts. Meaning that some parts of the facility can impact other parts of the facility. This in fact is what happened in Cleveland. There was an explosion in a part of the facility in Cleveland where fragments punctured the LNG tank, and then the LNG tank released its contents. So that's cascading impacts is something one needs to consider. In terms of a peak shaving facility is what you have, meaning it's a storage facility, relatively small. Some of them are very large, like in the one in Plymouth, Washington. The Williams Company had a big release there recently that is important to know about. It's because it's the most recent one, 3 or 4 years ago, in Plymouth, Washington. But the cascading impacts can come from, for example, if you have on your site, if you have a liquefaction facility, that means it also has refrigerants, other kinds of chemicals besides LNG, which can also have an accident or explosion and then impact the the LNG tank. Let me see where to go from there. Well, when the Williams LNG facility in in Plymouth, Washington, had its release. It was again a cascading impact release. It was explosion on the site, and it created fragments that then destroyed and damaged lots of the other facilities at the site. When the local fire service got wind that a fire was happening at the LNG facility, they called around to say, this was in a very rural part of Washington State, in Benton County, and they called around to find out who had any kind of recent hazmat training that might know about LNG. And they brought in Fire Chief Lonnie Click, I'm sorry, and from an adjacent county. Lonnie Click then testified later in a federal meeting that, and this is kind of sobering, that he had no knowledge at all of LNG. Most people don't have any knowledge of LNG. Most emergency responders in the country don't know anything about LNG. It is a very new part of the system. And Lonnie Click said, I got my LNG 101 as I was driving my truck to the site, a half an hour away to the site. When he got to the site and he saw that there was an LNG fire, he looked at the emergency response guidebook, and the emergency response guidebook is it's like the Bible of local emergency responders around the United States. It's published every 4 years by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And it's kind of a handy dandy guide with different colored pages that tells you in the first 20 minutes of an incident, what should the fire service think about doing right away? And in terms of LNG, in guide number 115, the emergency response guidebook says, if there's an LNG emergency, the first thing you should do is think about evacuating 1/2 mile away. Evacuating everybody for a radius of 1 mile. If there's a fire associated with this incident, you should evacuate 1 mile away. So that's why I think in your own WE company's application, they do actually put in there a couple of figures, like how many people live within a 1/2 mile and how many people live within a mile of the facility. They probably are thinking about people are going to be using this guidebook's recommendations as something important to know about. In terms of what they found in your facility, maybe you've already talked about this, within a 1/2 mile, there are 19 residences and 104 within a mile. And the nearest house is apparently 520 feet. So, so again, basically I've talked about what the kinds of potential consequences could be. Let me mention in a disheartening note, the U.S. Department of Transportation has already said that that they know that, for example, from an LNG tank car release, you can get a cloud that would move quite far, or you could move some distance into the community, is what they said. This was in their own in the U.S. DOT PHMSA environmental analysis about the Trump administration recent rule to open up the whole U.S. rail system to LNG transportation in tank cars, which has never been allowed up to now, and in 100 car links, unit trains they call them. So basically, PHMSA published an environmental impact statement that said, we realize that an LNG vapor cloud can move some distance into a community, but we are not going to calculate those distances because it's, quote, too difficult, unquote. Even though they admit that there are publicly available modeling, various kinds of models, gas models that could be used to do that, the government chose not to do that. Now that just is an indication about what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with governments at all levels that are basically operating usually on the notion of, let us not alarm the public. And I say that with great sadness as somebody who worked a lot on community right to know laws. And back in the day in 1986 and 1990, the United States passed community right to know laws, which created 4,100 local emergency planning committees around the United States. But I think the conclusion that we quickly came to, all the environmentalists who worked on this and the labor union people, is that the local emergency planning committees operate like a religious cult. Each of them, there's 4,100 of them. They operate like a religious cult that says, their common dogma is, let us not alarm the public. And so, I mean, I was in one in Washington, D.C. for several years, and I experienced that myself, you know, on firsthand. So, one thing that I didn't see in the WE application was any mention that they might need, like many LNG facilities being proposed these days, require what they call vapor barrier walls, anywhere from 20 to 100 feet tall. They put in special walls around a facility, like they're proposing at Jordan Cove in Coos Bay, Oregon, which is one of the more well-studied facilities by our experts as well as by the companies. They're putting in vapor barrier walls because they need to try to show that even if we have a serious release on the site, it will not get off site in any serious level, at any serious level. So we'll put up these walls. Now, I had mentioned to you before that one of the newly recognized hazards of LNG is that you can have, that if it gets confined, you can have serious explosions. Putting up vapor walls increases the danger on an LNG site, because what does a vapor wall do? When it does its job, it confines a vapor cloud and doesn't allow it to get into the community. It confines a cloud, which then is even more susceptible to a major kind of to a confined vapor cloud explosion. So some of the by the way, I just want to mention some distances that we sort of know about, is that some of the explosions that were revealed by the UK Health and Safety Executive Study that US agency funded was the Buncefield release of a gasoline vapor fire based on a gasoline vapor cloud that exploded. And what that means is that the vapor cloud fills up the entire site and then it explodes. And that explosion was felt 5 miles away from the point of release. So maybe I should definitely touch on the question about vapor the preparations of local emergency responders. It is a sad thing to say that local emergency responders are, in the first place, mostly very uneducated about this. But then when they do get some, quote, training from the industry about LNG risks, it's misleading training. Now, I learned this by looking at by talking to people who were being trained by the industry up and down the Florida East Coast, where they were shipping LNG by UN ISO containers up and down the Florida East Coast, but by rail on the Florida East Coast Railroad. And so I asked one of the hazmat fire chiefs, did you get that industry training? He said, oh yeah, we went in and took the industry training. We just laughed at it. He said, they were talking about LNG. He said, I'm not going to do any of that stuff. I'm not going to do any of that stuff. Meaning, I'm not going to do the kind of emergency response by barely trained local emergency responders that the industry was basically trying to convince us you could do. So I just want to say that I think you should assume that and it's not unusual. I mean, frankly, there have been a lot of media reports all over the United States in terms of the crude oil trains that were extremely misleading too. The industry would set up for emergency response training, and part of the training is that you bring the emergency responders out to what looks like a simulated tank car on fire, and then you show a picture in the newspaper the next day and on television of firefighters standing there with hoses, hosing onto a burning crude oil tank car. That's never going to happen. That is completely misleading, but it's designed to try to flummox the public that, okay, we know how to handle these dangerous chemicals, and therefore you can relax. I think you have to worry about what the level of regulation you're going to get from your state agencies and your local agencies. Let me just say that in the Miami case, when they put an LNG facility, a small LNG facility, in the middle of Miami, and it was called a New Fortress Energy Facility. When I say the middle of Miami, it was in the Hialeah rail yard in the middle of Miami. See, Congress has been so concerned about the dangers of LNG for so many decades that Congress has been repeatedly saying, if you want to build an LNG facility, seek remote siting. Nowhere near anybody. Seek remote siting. That is what Congress strongly has been hammering on for a very long time, including Senator Markey from Massachusetts, who recently got elected yesterday, reelected on a Democratic primary yesterday. But on the Florida East Coast, they not only had LNG being produced in a liquefaction facility in the middle of Miami, but they were shipping on the Florida East Coast Railroad through populated communities all the way up to Florida ports, which then would be exported to utilities that would use it, small numbers of small scale facilities, utilities in Barbados and Jamaica and so forth in the Caribbean. The thing to say about that is that facility that was located in the middle of Miami was not, the siting was never approved by any federal facility. FERC has abdicated their facility, their jurisdiction to regulate small scale LNG facilities. PHMSA did even worse. PHMSA just kind of genially did a neighborly tour of the site and then just kind of did a wink and a nod to the facility operator saying, we think your facility will meet federal regulations. PHMSA has no regulatory authority on siting of LNG facilities. They just did this as a favor to the company. And then the company goes to local city council people. I've talked to them, and the city council people said, well, we went over and took a tour of the site, and they assured us it was all perfectly safe. That is what you get when you have naive media people and naive local officials, and they don't have access to some pretty rigorous expertise to deal with this. Let me see if that, maybe I should just close there and see if you guys have, if some questions come up that would be important to deal with. I think I've mentioned the main things that I wanted to bring up so far.
All right, Tom, do you want to see if any of the people out there have questions? Okay, come on over. On this side. 1 second.
Sure.
Oh, wait, we've got one from the outside, so we'll let that happen quick. You can sit here for a minute and Tom, you can speak it into the computer if you've got it. We can see that there's things going on out there, but we don't have it. You can open the window if you want. Well, it will get louder in here. We'll get more echo.
There's a question from Facebook Live that Jessica just wrote in. I don't know if you can read that, Tiffany.
Do you want to just read it, Diane?
Okay, Jessica, you've got a question from Facebook Live. The average structure fire burns at 1100 degrees. LNG burns at over 2400 degrees. Is there a resource available that we as the public can use to try and determine the convection and/or thermal radiation at some distance from the site? The concern is at those homes less than 1,000 feet away that if the plant burns, the heat transfer may be high enough to in turn ignite surrounding homes.
Well, the short answer is yes, there are models that can be used to do that. And in fact, that is something that definitely the site has already committed that they will, the WE application says they will consider fire radiation as one of the hazards as well. I haven't mentioned that as often as other kinds of hazards because the explosions and downwind dispersion hazards seem to have much more mass potential. You realize, of course, that if a company is putting vapor barrier walls around their facility to keep the cloud in from getting outside to the community, and then there's a big explosion or fire inside, you assume that everybody on the site is dead. They're sacrificed in this kind of a strategy. You assume that, I mean, unless they somehow, you know, get word from some saint that they should start running earlier. The fact is that that if there's a terrible, serious emergency, the mitigation devices are designed to try to keep the site from having any impact outside, but nobody ever said that the local workers would not get impacted. So that is, by the way, another reason why it would be important to think about talking with experts who are with various of the major chemical trade unions, like like USW, Health and Safety Director, and so forth, about the unionized sector's view of this kind of situation.
Well, it's our understanding that it will be monitored remotely. There won't be employees really at the site.
That may be the case. This is a very small site. It may be that there'll be no employees on the site. It's just that for most chemical facilities, there are not only a few employees on the site, two or four or something like that in terms of a peak shaving facility, a typical peak shaving facility, but also that occasionally there will be, truck loading going on where truck drivers are bringing their vehicles in and out as well. Again, we don't have those kinds of data. We don't have those kinds of facts about your facility. This is a very minimal application.
All right, so we have a question from outside, and then we've got a question from inside. So the outside question is, Wisconsin enacted Act 67, which allows for conditional uses to be approved without raising issues. Maybe, we don't really know, and we're wondering if you have any experience with this, and how do we deal with that?
I'm sorry, I missed the first couple of lines of your question.
We have a legal act called Act 67, which may allow for like conditional uses to be approved without like going over the board. So it's basically taking away local control. We're just wondering if you have any issue or any experience with that, and if you know how we might deal with that.
No, I have to say I really don't have any experience at all with.
Okay.
The WE application cites a couple of places, and in a couple of places they cite the Wisconsin Administrative Code. And I did call a couple of state agencies, including the Public Service Commission, when I heard about the situation. And sure enough, they are planning to deal with this. And I don't know whether some other agencies involved as well, a safety committee agency or something, but the Public Service Commission was, and they were actually happy to get some information from me. So so basically, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about the other peculiarities of Wisconsin law.
Okay, and just so everybody outside knows, we have spoken to a few lawyers this week, so we have a little bit of data that we'll give after this speech about what we found this week and where we're going to go with that. So I'm going to pass it over to Vic, who's got another question.
Fred, I have a question about first responders. I talked to our fire chief today, and he's told me he was very confident that this would be a very safe facility. As a matter of fact, I asked the question about the emergency response guidebook, and I was hoping that we would get to, the very specifics of a LNG facility. Never really did. He was so confident that there's not going to be a problem that he basically told me that they're not even talking about an evacuation response. Is there anything in that DOT emergency response guidebook that would say otherwise?
Oh yeah, you should definitely get a copy of the Emergency Response Guidebook. It's widely known as the Orange Book. You could actually stop by a fire station and say, let me look at your ERG, but you could also order them online for about $5 each or something like that. It is millions, I mean, it is in every single fire service vehicle in the entire country. The U.S. Department of Transportation distributes it widely all over the country, and it is the Bible of local emergency responders. And so when in the Washington accident, Chief Click got to the site, he must have been looking at the Emergency Response Guidebook. It said that if there's a fire, evacuate 1 mile. And I forgot to mention this. He put on a safety factor. He evacuated a 2-mile radius around the facility. And this was in a very unpopulated area of Washington State. Now, that's just a cautious fire chief, okay, being extra careful, because he was also uneducated. Here he is, next to a very large pig shaving facility, and everybody in the surrounding area is completely ignorant about it. So on the one hand, you don't have a whole lot of people in the world who like to get up and say, I'm really ignorant about all this, and if something happened, I don't know what I would do. On the other hand, imagine if you were trying to hire a fire chief, and you're a professional fire chief, I mean, and then they have a job to lose after that, and you're hiring a professional fire chief, and you say, our criterion, chief, is that we need you to be able to get up in public and say, we live in a really dangerous community here. I want to emphasize that. And if we have a dangerous situation, there's very little I could do except run like all the rest of you guys. You can't hire a fire chief who would say that. They all basically say, well, I've had a look at this. I've been to see the company training. They look like they're doing it okay to me. I mean, who does he know? What does he know from? So I just say that is one of the dangers of this is the emergency responders themselves not being really well equipped to deal with the real potentials of an LNG facility. But one thing you could do is just try to suggest, you can ask questions like, are we going to have a community 2-mile radius evacuation drill?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fred, I have a follow-up question too.
Yeah.
We have a very small fire department, but we're linked in with, according to our fire chief, 55 other responders. And I think what he was trying to tell me was that don't worry about it because we have all this backup. If there's an explosion and a subsequent fire from the tank area, can anybody put that out?
You cannot put out an LNG fire.
Mm.
Now, an explosion, that's already happened, right? I mean, there's no way the explosion is an explosion. And then what you can get is inside the plant, you can get, or even outside the plant, you can get a shrapnel. You can get huge fragments of the plant, like what happens at the Williams facility in Plymouth, Washington. You can get huge parts of the plant weighing several tons can be thrown 300 feet away. I mean, they call it debris. I would call it shrapnel, right? Because it was a miracle that nobody was killed with that in that Williams situation. There were 5 workers that were burned and went to a hospital. Only 1 was actually brought in to the hospital for treatment, but basically there were 5 injuries and no deaths, and it was a miracle because it was a really big deal. So, and again, that was a peak shaving facility that was larger than yours, but see, frankly, I don't even know how much larger because I don't even know how large your facility is, given the skeleton nature of the application that you have from WE.
Thank you.
I have a question. The We Energies representatives said that they, if there's a fire, they apply foam. So can LNG fires be put out with foam?
Maybe it's about the size of a teacup. I mean, nobody's going to get near an LNG fire. I mean, theoretically you could do that, I mean, but look, again, you know, a media article that shows firefighters applying water or foam to a crude oil tank car or to an LNG tank car or to any kind of LNG container is just completely hogwash. You know, I mean, it is not. I mean, you know, the fire service has two major principles, right? One is save lives, and that means their own lives, and the next is protect property. But save lives comes first. And that fire chief in Florida who says, I'm not doing any of that stuff, he was not being a chicken. He was not being unprofessional. He was doing what he's a chief. He's a hazmat fire chief, right? He's got another. Most people who are hazmat fire chiefs have got enough training about hazardous materials potentials that they get more and more worried, not less and less worried. They get more and more appreciative of how little they can do. Now, the best they can do is save lives, like as the emergency response guidebook says, if there's a fire involved, evacuate a mile. In the first 20 minutes, evacuate a mile is what this book is all about, what to do in the first 20 minutes, the emergency response guidebook. Later than that, you might make decisions to enlarge the evacuation zone. So.
All right. Oh, so we've got at least three questions in the backlog here. So the first one is, and I've seen this a couple of times, people are really concerned about our elementary school. Our elementary school is somewhere between a half mile and a mile, depending on where exactly the tank is sited. But we think it's about 3/4 of a mile from the facility. What risks do our elementary school have?
You know, if I mean, I'll try to put it somewhat facetiously, just to make a point. If an LNG cloud traveled towards that school, I mean, any kind of LNG accident at that facility is probably going to cause an immediate evacuation of the elementary school, just as a precaution, even if there's nothing happening except something at the facility itself. But you know, and again, we don't know how far away. We can't do any calculations about how far a cloud could go from that facility based on the information that we have. I can't do that myself anyway. I'm not a modeler, and I'm not an expert on modeling. But you know, the state of Wisconsin should be hiring a consultant. They can do a very professional job of modeling what could happen. And one of the questions you should insist that they cover is, what are the potentials for an elementary school that's that close to a major facility, to a dangerous facility? Can't hear you.
Yeah. So I think to dovetail on that, and I've seen this, I mean, I have this question as well as I've seen it. So you have mentioned quite a few places where you're saying they're not providing enough information. They haven't done this risk modeling. And is there any way that we can request or demand more defined information from the proposal, or like how do we go about like getting them to do what it seems like they should be doing, or what recourse do we have here?
Well, you know, the key phrase in the application from WE is that they say that the engineering is not yet complete. They haven't made all their engineering decisions about how large this plant's going to be and exactly what the shape of it's going to look like. They haven't done all that. Now, as a company, they're entitled to do that. But, you know, as a community, you're entitled to say, well, don't come in here and ask us for for an advance permission, advance approval of a facility that with so little information about it. You know, that is basically your option here is you can't tell a company, well, hurry up and do the damn engineering. You know, basically they're going to do it when they feel like it. Now let me be optimistic again. There are so many LNG facilities around the world and in the United States that have recently gotten fairly far along in a planning direction and then been canceled. And that's because the worldwide market for LNG has tanked, has just plunged down. and there's no assurance it's ever going to come back anything. Now, on the other hand, there are some over exuberant investors who are still trying to spend a bunch of money thinking that LNG will eventually recover as a major part. I mean, my latest information from the trade press, and by the way, Justin McCullough has covered all this stuff really well, is that there are lots of savvy investors who are saying, well, maybe instead of investing in LNG, I should invest in renewables. And maybe they say it looks like that a large part of the business community and the investor community has decided LNG is not the future like we thought it was going to be. It's not the bridge fuel to the future. In fact, renewables are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper all the time. And so therefore, investing in LNG is a risk. So even though there's a few places in the world where, like in Mozambique, for God's sakes, they want to build a giant LNG facility there, export facility and infrastructure there, because of its closeness to the Asian market and all that. I mean, there might be an Asian market, but you know, by the way, Russia can furnish natural gas to Asia and to Europe through pipelines, which is much cheaper than American LNG or Mozambique LNG. I mean, the market is got numerous players from different countries, and unfortunately, our administration now is trying to bully our allies, like in Europe, to say we insist that you buy American LNG. And Angela Merkel from Germany says to Mr. Trump, well, Mr. Trump, look, we're willing to bring in some LNG from different sources. We'll build a few import terminals, but your LNG by ship is going to have to be at a price that is what we will accept. In other words, to match what we can get from Russia or other people, from Qatar or from wherever. So an LNG bet is a very risky bet, which is optimistic and is for people who are in a community where there's a proposed facility, because you know that at some point, even the investors of the facility might kind of take a look at this and say, let's cut our losses. We're just not going to go down that road.
And in that vein, we do have the Sierra Club legally fighting that argument on this particular proposal. So there is pushback in that way, and they are going to have to defend themselves from that.
I'm sorry, from which?
Sierra Club is fighting on the basis of price, that it is not cost competitive for the consumers.
You know, one thing that I learned from a major chemical industry executive years and years ago was that his principle he wanted to impress upon me was, he said, Fred, I'm glad you're doing the work that you're doing about community right to know about chemical risks in the community. I'm glad you're doing that work. But he said, understand that the really major safety improvements in any very dangerous chemical facility or industry is because of the corporation's own fear of liability. Deep pocket corporations don't want to be liable for some terrible accident that happens, and then they have to pay out a ton of money. Union Carbide, who had an American company that had that big accident in Bhopal, India, eventually went bankrupt and it no longer exists. All right, I mean, it is a terrible liability to have a major dangerous facility in an urban area, for example. But I mean, again, he was saying to me, in effect, the work that you do about trying to get the word out about the risks plays in to the industry's liability concerns. The industry's own corporate liability lawyers are telling them, hey, you know, this stuff looks really dangerous. Are we sure we can do this for a long time, really, and make a profit? Because the industry is always worried that, I mean, they need to be able to say, well, we neither knew nor could have known that we could have such a terrible disaster. Well, the more that communities raise concerns about the risk, the more they can't say we never knew nor could have known. So their own liability defenses work in a sense in our favor in that way.
All right, Fred, I've got two more, and I'm just going to give you them both so that we can make sure they both get answered. The first is, I just want you to say, since I'm guessing that you've seen a lot of these proposals, I want you to say, because we're hoping that our board members watch this, I want you to just say if this particular proposal is actually like less fleshed out than most that you see. Like, did they not do a lot of the things that they generally do. And then the second one, people are concerned about groundwater. They want to know if there's any risks, because everybody out here is on a well. Is there any risks to water?
You know, I'm really not very expert about the water thing, to take that first. There are many others in the environmental community who are experts on water quality issues, Sierra Club and NRDC and everybody. So I'll just pass on that. But I don't know of any LNG facility where water quality has been raised as a primary issue. It's usually a question about occupational and public safety in terms of the terrible risks of LNG fires and explosions and off-site vapor clouds. I'm sorry, I forgot the first question again.
The first question is just, is this unusually scarce in data engineering proposal risk analysis than these kinds of proposals usually are?
You know, I have to say that I usually only see proposals that are more fully fleshed out in terms of a draft environmental impact statement or a much more fully presented proposal. But that doesn't mean that some companies don't do exactly what this company has done. Was like, you know, it's just it's very normal corporate behavior to say, let's get all the permits that we need. Let's get all of our ducks in a row here. Let's get started with all the permits that we need, and we'll go to the local folks and give them a bribe of a bunch of money over the next several years, and we'll get a quick approval, and then we'd say the local community really likes this. The fire chief is very comfortable, et cetera, et cetera. So it's completely not, I think, not unusual, but I think it does, the minimal nature of this application gives you a handle to go to anybody, any local official, legislators or agencies, and say, you know, look, why can't we get more information about this?
Okay, and I guess I have one more question, if you're able.
Sure.
The last question is, what do you think we can expect in this fight? We've already got quite a bit of pushback from our board. We're not exactly feeling listened to. We understand why, but we've also been getting kind of a lot of pushback from the newspapers. The spokesman for our energy company is obviously starting to get frustrated with us. So I'm just curious, how do you usually see this escalating, and how, what do you have to say to us about that?
Well, you know, you have different phases of this going on. You have the local approvals that are being sought, but the main thing is going to happen at the state level with the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. Apparently, I mean that's just my rough guesstimate of where the action is going to be in terms of approvals, and you have time, you know, to work on that, and they have got to hire experts, and they've got to do what looks like a credible job of estimating the risk. It's very, very likely that even if they estimate that the risk theoretically, that there are theoretically some accidents that could cause off-site impacts into the nearest residences or whatever, that they're going to say that, look, those accidents are so improbable, it is so unlikely that it's not going to hold us up from getting this facility that the utility wants, and that maybe the local community is saying, oh yeah, we like that idea of money coming in. So, I mean, I don't think anybody could say this is not going to be a hard fight. That's the kind of pushback you're going to get on a technical level is okay, even if you can show that the potential consequences, the consequences is always the first level of analysis, what could happen. But then the agencies and others will come in with, and this is why I don't know the Wisconsin administrative code or anything, or their track record about any of this, but I mean, the company is certainly going to be arguing, and maybe their consultants as well. Well, but look, if we choose a very small hole as the scenario for a release, and that means that it doesn't get off the site, you can't tell us to choose a bigger hole, because the bigger hole accident is much, much less probable. And that's true. Statistically, it's much less probable. But the question is, who gets to decide? You know, which scenario is going to be adopted here? So that's going to be a struggle. But it's not that, you know, and this is a small facility and it's in a relatively rural area, relatively compared to some of the other things like what was going on in Florida and what's going on with LNG between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So you have to anticipate that the probability side of that is going to be raised as well as the consequence side.
Okay. One more question from Jess, who's got a house across the street from the LNG proposal, is if you, Fred, had a LNG facility built across the road from you, would you move?
You know, I don't have the luxury of owning a house, so I've never actually even thought about that. But I would certainly think about it. I would certainly think. I mean, because I mean, I would certainly not rest easy thinking that local officials have got all this handled. For example, I mean, I would be asking local officials, when do we get a neighborhood evacuation drill where an accident is actually postulated and we get to see how fast we can evacuate my apartment building.
Come say thank you. You come do this.
Hi, Fred, it's Mary. I just
Hi,
want to
Mary.
thank you so much for contacting us and for meeting with us. We really appreciate your insight. We have a lot of people out here with their mouths kind of going, so that's good.
Well, my privilege. I'm glad, you know, I'm glad to help any way I can.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
We're going to stay in touch. Is that okay?
You sure? And you guys probably need to go do some organizational business, right?
I think they're swatting mosquitoes out there, actually.
So I should sign out, right?
Yeah, it's pretty bad up here in Wisconsin. Thank
Okay.
you so much. We'll let you
All
go, and we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Okay. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yay. Do you want to share a little bit about lawyers and to-dos
Yeah.
to people quick?
Oh, you still see me? Hey, guys.
They're still seeing you.
Scary. Hi, Diane.
And all of Facebook also was seeing you?
Oh, I don't like that at all.
I'm sorry.
We're still talking with lawyers. I talked to another one today. I don't want to get into too much detail here about that because it's a legal issue, but my main focus is that we need funds. We need to fight this. Diane has set up a GoFundMe page. If you would even be able to give $20, $10, just to show there's activity in there, would really be appreciated. I know we have a goal of 10,000. If we do hire an attorney and get into this, that's not going to nearly cover it, but at least it'll get us started. So I'm just urging everyone to go on GoFundMe, give whatever you can. It really be appreciated. At least it shows your support if you could give a little bit of something. Okay. What else do you want to talk about tonight?
Yeah, we'll be continuing to do the GoFundMe. We also want to recommend that anybody that hasn't already, if you could or would make an appointment with We Energies to speak with them, even if you don't want to, even if you don't agree with this, I feel like it's going to show that we care and we want to get informed. We don't need this to be a war. We really should, you know, get all the data from all sides. So if you could go to that, if you feel like sitting at the booth, just to be willing to pass out our postcards or pass out signs or just to talk to people about the other side on that day, that would be really helpful. We're going to have a table out there. There is a sign up for that. We will put it up on Facebook again today if you haven't seen it. And we will be having a meeting here again next Wednesday where we'll just be sort of talking about to-dos, planning for what we want to do before the 14th board meeting, which we hope everybody is planning to do and everybody has on their calendar. So thank you everybody for coming. Anybody that has any questions, feel free to go up to Tom while we're still here, or we can come out.
And we have,
Oh yeah, and I just got the got a text. Also, don't forget to write emails. I know it's hard. I know it's annoying, but they really need to know that you care if you do. Like, don't do it if you don't care. But obviously, if you are caring, we just really need them to understand how many of us there are that really care about our community and our homes and our families. So yeah, if you can get out there and send those emails.
And there's more signs. We have got 100 more signs here. There's some here, and there's some over at Janet Faust's house on Gopher Hill Road.
And if you need that address, ask on Facebook. We'll try to put the address out. We're also going to have more postcards there. If you want to go door to door, you can pick them up at Janet's house. We'll have them there with the signs. Anything else? Anybody out in the peanut gallery have anything?
I'm gonna come out there by you guys.
We'll be out in just a second. We're just in the house. So, I'm going to shut down for the Facebook feed if no one else has anything to share. So please let me know if you do before I end this digital version of this thing.
I can report that we have about 25, just shy of $2,500 so far in our GoFundMe. So
Okay.
keep contributing, people, please. Every little bit helps.
We're also going to be contributing with checks. So I know that there are a few people that have, given cash. It doesn't get the GoFundMe tax if you donate that way. So that's also great. Let's just double check that there's not anything else. List of locations that have been visited with postcards. Diana, we will work on that. I don't exactly know. It hasn't been the most organized effort, but we will see. I'll put it out to the world and see who we think has been gotten. Anything else on Facebook? Peanut Gallery outside? No questions. All right, we're going to end this thing. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Thank you for the 26 people who are still hanging on Facebook. I'm guessing a lot more people we'll see tomorrow. So good night, everybody.